Well, good morning, everybody. Good day, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon what part of the world you're in. And welcome to the Mainstreaming Working Group of the Scaling Community of Practices webinar. We have a very exciting program today, but before I get into that, I just want to give a little background for those of you who are not, or this might be your first webinar or not familiar with the Scaling Community of Practice. As I said, my name is Richard Cole, and this is the Mainstreaming Scaling Working Group. The Community of Practice is a community that exists to exchange knowledge and experience about scaling up and international development. In the last few years, we have also been generating knowledge products in areas such as what is good scaling practice, how to integrate systems change and scaling, and monitoring and evaluation and scaling. About 2.5 years ago, we launched a strategic initiative to study and provide lessons learned and good practices on how to mainstream scaling into an international development organization, whether primarily funders and donors, but also implementing organizations. We've published already on our website about 14 case studies of integrating scaling, including one of the CGIAR, which is the topic of today's webinar. And we're on pace to have about 25 cases by the end of the summer. So please look on the website, Scaling Community of Practice, for those case studies, the ones that exist, the ones that are forthcoming, and we expect to have a final synthesis report by the end of the summer. We also are right now launching a 5-year campaign to mainstream or center scaling in international development. We feel that the time is ripe, given the current crises in international development and climate change, particularly in funding with the elimination of USAID, that we need to focus more than ever on scaling up as a critical element of good practice in international development. We just can't expect to have the resources we need to solve the world's most pressing development and climate change problems, and we need to be really focused on scaling. So without further ado, I'd like to get started with today's webinar. We are delighted to have a webinar today on the experience of the CGIAR on mainstreaming scaling. For those who don't know, but I'm sure our speakers will tell us, CGIAR has been around for over 50 years. It's a network of international agricultural research centers and programs that primarily work on research and innovation in the agri-food space, though there are many cross-cutting themes as well, such as climate change and gender. We have 3 speakers today, Mark Schutt, Julian Colomer, and Tim Krupnik. It's incredibly exciting what the CGIAR is doing. Mark is going to talk about some of the tools that the CGIAR has developed and how they have been rolling those out internally to help their staff integrate scaling into their research and innovation work. Julian will be talking about how they have also in parallel developed a way to do portfolio monitoring and management of scaling and innovations more generally as they progress along an innovation to scaling pathway as an organization as a whole. And last but not least, Tim Krupnik is going to talk about a almost brand new program that the CGIAR has launched that has 2 goals. One, to scale up many of the innovations that the CGIAR has developed, as well as integrating scaling into the way that the organization works throughout the entire organization, all of its centers and programs. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Schutt. Mark, would you introduce yourself and then please your presentation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. And thank you everybody for joining this webinar. My name is Mark Schutt. I'm joining you from Kenya today. I work with CGIAR and with Wageningen University and have an expertise in innovation and scaling. So before we go into a little bit more about the approach that CGIAR is mainstreaming for scaling, I just wanted to say a few words about what is CGIAR. CGIAR, for those of you who don't know it, of course, CGIAR is the largest agricultural and agri-food research system in the world. We have an annual turnover of approximately $1 billion US. and have been delivering biofortified crops, improved agronomy practices, policy advice, and other kinds of innovations to the world over the last 50 or so years. So the part I will be talking about is an approach that's called Scaling Readiness. And maybe before going into the details, innovation is very much at the heart of what CGIAR is doing. We call it our core business. And without spending too much time on definitions or so, we see innovations as solutions to problems. So they can be completely new products or services, but they can also be solutions that have been tested, validated in some geo context, and then brought into others. Innovations can be both of technological and non-technological nature. We know in many organizations, innovations equals technology, but we also work on non-technological innovations, so it's capacity development programs, policy innovations, and other types of institutional innovation. CGIAR is pretty unique in that it supports both innovation development, so research and innovation, but also innovation use and impact at scale. And we have a pretty large portfolio of innovations that Jules will speak about. So the problem that CGIAR faced late 2020s was that we didn't have a systematic approach to track our innovations. So it's a little bit visualized through this pile of Lego that we know that we have a lot of innovations efforts going on, but we couldn't really organize it in a certain way. The second problem that we were facing was what we refer to as the scaling black box. So we have a lot of innovation work going on, but we can't really link it clearly to achieving sustainable development goals. Thirdly, we saw that there's a little bit of a gap, or there's a big gap actually, between the science competencies in the organization and the scaling competencies in the organization. So some of our key assets are scientists and researchers in the organization. And we saw that they don't have the right kind of capacities to actually take those innovations to scale. Last but not least, we don't have a prioritization framework, which didn't help us in using evidence to make sure that we allocate resources on those innovations that actually have a higher potential of achieving impact at scale. So the solution that we put in place is referred to as Scaling Readiness, and Scaling Readiness really tries to bridge the gap between research and development. It supports innovation teams in designing impact pathways with scale in mind, and it's an evidence-based approach to innovation portfolio management. And we put the website up for those of you who want more information. So Scaling Readiness approach basically builds out of on technology readiness levels that are used by NASA. And technology readiness levels go all the way from 0 to 9, where 0 is an idea, so an idea about possible solution to a problem. And you take that idea through like a process of basic research, conceptualization, proof of concept, and then testing in controlled, semi-controlled, or uncontrolled conditions. And we somehow took this idea that NASA developed and translated it for CGIAR use. So we translated it from being a technological or technology readiness level to an innovation readiness level, because we work on technological innovations, but also on non-technological innovations. And then we added a second metric that follows the same logic, which is referring to innovation use. So this is a metric that's not necessarily focusing on how many farmers reached or how many clients are using the innovation, but it's more about, it's focused on network penetration. So basically we measure how far an innovation actually penetrates into an innovation network. as a measure of success. So those two metrics combined, we developed, we tested, we fine-tuned with different kinds of projects, both within and outside of CGIAR, applying both to agricultural innovations, but also to non-agricultural innovations. So how does it work? So basically, the approach tries to support innovations along its impact pathway. So all the way from innovations as outputs to innovations in use and innovations that actually have impact. And then cross-cutting is the innovation portfolio management approach. But it shows that there's periods in an innovation pathway where it's really about like the R&D, so the testing, designing, the validation of the innovation itself. Then at some point, it's going to be more about the enabling environment, so putting innovations into a specific context, making sure that the finance, the policy, the market, capacity enablers are there for that innovation to actually reach people and benefit people. And then ultimately, when many people use innovations that are proven to work, we hope to achieve impact. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what happens at each of these stages. So innovation profiling is really about collecting basic evidence on an innovation development trajectory. So you can see here, we have a title on innovation, we have a basic description, we show how it contributes to different kinds of impact areas, who are the partnerships, or who are the partners that we are working with, what are the sustainable development goals, what are some of the responsible innovation or scaling considerations, what is the geo-focus of the innovation, and probably most importantly, the level of readiness that you can see on the right side of the page. So the readiness level is something very important because it can help us to avoid that we scale innovations prematurely. So obviously, we don't want to transfer the innovation development risk to farmers. And unfortunately, there have been cases where innovations were scaled, but not yet proven to work. So basically, you put something in the hands of already vulnerable populations that's not proven to work, which is, of course, a big risk. So the innovation readiness level is supported by evidence, and that evidence is going through a quality assurance process. So we are pretty sure, like for each of these innovations, that the readiness level is supported by evidence. The second level, so for innovations that are already at a certain level of readiness, in this case, let's say level 6, we support innovation packaging. So innovation packaging is really to put standalone innovations into a specific context. So in this case, it's about a thermal tolerant vaccine in Mali. And you can see that the vaccine itself is at level 6 in terms of readiness. But for the vaccine to be accessible and usable for farmers, we need all kinds of other solutions to be in place. So think about an awareness campaign, think about production and distribution of the vaccine, think about subsidy or finance programs, think about building capacity, think about community marketing authorizations, and so forth and so forth. So really looking at, what are the enabling conditions for this innovation to actually be of use. And then by ranking or by assessing the readiness and use of such an innovation package, we identify what are some of the barriers or challenges that we need to work on. So those are visualized in this barrel where you can see that the water is leaking out from the lowest stave. That follows that provides a basis for an intervention plan that is then monitored year by year. So you can see here on the left-hand side was the original situation. On the right-hand side is the year after investment was made in scaling this package. We developed detailed strategies for making these packages more investment ready that has all kinds of detailed information, problem statement and demand, the package, of course, scaling pathways, costs and benefits, financial plans, etc., etc. And this we only do for those packages that really have high impact potential. So with that, I'm handing over to Jules.
Hi everyone, my name is Jules Colomer. I'm the director of the Portfolio Performance Unit. We're a small unit in the CGIAR that do a couple of, I think, really critical things for the system. First, we help CGIAR tell its impact story, so we oversee technical reporting. Secondly, we provide data decision support insights to decision makers in the organization, but also outside, IP partners and funders. And third, we scale best-of-class approaches to performance and results management, including innovation, portfolio management, and the scaling work that Mark has just been talking about. Okay, so the portfolio management problem, or actually opportunity, I think is probably a better way to put it, is that we have a range of questions about our innovation portfolio. Funders contacting us on what we have ready to combat child vitamin A deficiencies in Laos. Questions around what are the portfolio gaps that we should mobilize basic research funds around. Questions of prioritization. What do we put on hold? What do we cut? What do we double down on in shifting funding scenarios? How to mitigate responsible scaling challenges, which innovations are making good progress towards impact, what are those types of characteristics that we want to design for, and what are the types of innovations that are receiving a relatively larger share of partner co-investment. So those are the challenges, the problems, the opportunities that we face. Another, let's say, more real-world one was just on a call with our integrated partnership board 2 days ago, and we presented some of the findings about the changing trajectory of our innovation portfolio, increasing readiness levels in specific types of innovations. And one of the board members asked, is that good? Is a change in readiness level over time what we want to see? And I think that's exactly the type of question that the portfolio management aims to be able to address. Okay, so how are we mainstreaming scaling? So we have an approach looking at methods, mindsets, and mechanisms, which is a holistic approach. It's a stepwise approach also that works towards innovation portfolio management as an organizational change process. We recognize that going from that pile of Lego, as Mark earlier put it, to something more organized, something more usable, something more coherent will take time. And that's how we've been making progress and building this as step by step. We have approximately 5 full-time equivalents working across CGIAR on this. Numbers may fluctuate year by year. In terms of methods, in terms of our data systems and criteria, we have a CGIAR-wide system called the Performance and Results Management System that collects results data. It's also actually a planning tool. So we have our program and accelerator theories of change, our plans of results and budget, increasingly linked to our theories of change, and then we're able to report against that through an integrated system. Currently, about 40% of the total portfolio by budget reports and uses this one integrated system called the Performance and Results Management System, largely on what we call the pooled funding. So we have an approach there with criteria, with definitions, with very well-defined data fields, and we're able to quality assure those and basically leverage or extract value from the data that is reported in the system on an annual basis. Then in terms of mindset, well, we have a scaling community on LinkedIn. I encourage you to join if you're not already a member. There are over 700 active members of that community on LinkedIn. We're aiming there really to generate a lot of interaction and good community interaction. We have a scaling week. This is the 3rd one that we had in 2024, so it's grown year on year. There is another one coming up, I believe, in November 2025. Maybe, Mark, you could put the dates in the chat. So that's been increasingly successful, and many new partners and new participants are joining that Scaling Week. And we also have a range of internal and external capacity building and training courses on innovation and scaling. Mark, if you want to also stick the link to that in the chat. So we're building the capacity, we're connecting people, and we're also providing these events where we can share learning and experience across the community. And then in terms of our mechanisms, we have, obviously, Tim is going to talk after me about this new program, the Scaling for Impact program. It's really the key way in which scaling is going to be scaled and rolled out in the CGIAR. We have a new technical reporting arrangement for the next 6 years called the CGIAR Technical Reporting Arrangement. It's basically an agreement between the key funders and in our system council and members of across the CGIAR, the centers, program and accelerators, all coming together and really agreeing on what is the shape, flavor, content, timing, quality, etc. of the technical reporting. So there's a section in there on scaling and on innovation portfolio management, how we're going to be building on the success and learning from the failures of what we've been doing so far. And I'll stick a link in the chat to that. And then we also have a scaling fund, which was launched in 2024, I believe. So the progress that we've been making to date across that 40% of the portfolio by funding, we have just over 1,000 innovations being reported as being developed. We have around 500 innovations with more than one data point. So once you report an innovation, it's mandatory to report it on a year-on-year basis. In our previous portfolio from 2017 to 2021, this was not mandatory. And so you could report an innovation and then it just sort of sat there and you couldn't really tell what had happened to it. And we only had something like less than 7% of our total innovations had more than one data point. So it was really difficult, actually impossible to track trends or anything over time. So we think we've made a good step in addressing that by making that a mandatory update on a year-on-year basis. We have over 300 innovations in use and over 60 innovation packages designed and reported, and they're all available to you through the CGIAR results dashboard, which you can access scanning that QR code. I'll also stick the link in the chat if Mark doesn't beat me to it. Having 3 years of data really allows us to start to mine that data for more and more interesting types of insights and synthesis around what's working where, with who and why, and how much it's costing, for example, as well as what's being stopped and why. And so this is also quite a new thing for CGIAR. Our funders are consistently asking us not just to tell them what we're starting that's new and exciting, but what we're stopping and why. And so this is the first time really that we have consistent data on what innovations are being stopped and why. And so that's about 10% of all innovations were stopped in 2024. So that's about 140 innovations stopped in 2024 for a number of reasons, as you can see there. Okay. We can then slice and dice the data for different parts or different users and use cases. So we've got project level summaries, thematic summaries, geographic or country level summaries, center level summaries, and increasingly on this, we're getting into topic clusters and being able to actually look at what the innovations are about rather than just count of readiness level, etc. What are the actual, let's say, thematic contents of those innovations, and you'll be seeing more of that type of analysis coming from the CG pretty soon. But just to say, like, we have the ability, the results dashboard is a great resource. You can get the data that you need from it, and we also have the capacity then to, as I mentioned, slice and dice it. Increasingly, we're now linking or providing the opportunity for those reporting on innovations to link investments to innovation. This is another constant query and requirement from our funders that we really need to move on. And this is one, I think, useful starting point to better link dollars to results. Obviously, we have a time lag issue between when an investment actually can be said to contribute to impact between 15 and 20 years. And so we are looking for ways to better link dollars to actual progress towards that, and having the ability to actually demonstrate the pooled or non-pooled, that's essentially our bilateral largely, or partner co-investment in innovations at different readiness levels over time is starting to give us the basis to better talk about the return or potential return on investment. So from Mark's messy pile of Lego diagram on the left, we have made good progress. I would say the challenges around duplication, poor evidence base, no trend data, and innovation not being mapped to theories of change or impact pathways, that is slowly and surely being resolved. It's not perfect. It's not consistent across the entire portfolio, but it's pretty good. And for 40% of the portfolio, it's actually good enough to start informing decision making. And that's really part of the cycle of where we go next on this, is around using the information for prioritization, increasing coherence, learning and adaptive management, developing strategic partnerships, and better targeted resource mobilization. So we're making good progress. We're not there yet in terms of an overall innovation portfolio management approach, but there is strong progress. So as mentioned, one of the key next steps really is moving from data and analytics into decision making and actually delivering value from the decision. And that's really important, I guess, fulcrum or crux moment that we're in. Ensuring that the innovation portfolio management intelligence is used in prioritization and resource allocation and decision processes, better linking supply and demand, and moving from that 40% coverage to higher coverage. The new portfolio from 2025 to 2030 in the CGIAR will integrate all funding streams. So we will see movement towards 80 and beyond % coverage by funding of this approach in the CGIAR. Okay, we have some portfolio management decision support tools being developed. I won't speak too much about this. We are, I would say, amongst the early adopters of demonstrating let's say, appropriate use of artificial intelligence augmentation and enhancement in the things that we do. And so this is one of those areas where we do so. We apply AI for our quality assurance, as well as then developing these portfolio decision support tools. Again, I won't go into it too much, but basically a tool is being developed that will better guide potential investors in terms of how and where to allocate their funding based on certain criteria and parameters. Okay, so the beating heart of the new CG portfolio. So we think that the new CG portfolio of programs and accelerators can only really work well with an effective innovation portfolio management approach. You can see the tip of the crayon or the top of the rocket there, however you want to interpret that diagram, has the Scaling for Impact at the top. That means that the Scaling for Impact program is an integral component of the portfolio, and therefore the data that it requires is that innovation package, innovation portfolio management data, really to underpin the success of the entire program. And so we are actively documenting and sharing our learning, both success and failure. A couple of more papers available here. And we'd really appreciate the interaction if you'd like to learn more. So thanks so much. Now I'll hand over to Tim.
Thanks, Jules. Okay. Very happy to now talk about essentially work that builds on what Mark presented and also builds on what Jules presented. And that's the new CGIAR Scaling for Impact program. What's really important also coming off of Jules' presentations is that this program is supported by the work that Jules has described. It's also designed to support the work that Jules has described. But really what the Scaling for Impact program about is taking the best of class innovations that were described by both Mark and Jules and finding ways to drive the innovations and the science done through them into impact. And that needs to be done, as Mark and Jules both identified, by essentially working on fewer, higher impact, more promising innovations. And the program focuses on how to move them into scale. So to go through a little bit more detail about what the program does, we designed this program last year. For those that are not with CGIAR on the call, I did check, and a number of you are not CGIAR, and a number of colleagues are also with CGIAR, so I'll try to speak to both. But we designed a program last year, and it's been off and running since January of this year. We're essentially trying to do something that's really very ambitious, which is recognizing that the CGIAR and all of its centers that are involved in developing innovations provide a very strong foundation for science aimed at overcoming challenges in food, land, and water systems during a climate crisis. But the work that we do typically is generating widgets, knowledge, tools, technologies, and such. Many of them, unfortunately, remain on the shelf. And that's what the last two presentations talked about, identifying those that are most promising and moving them into use. And so the Scaling for Impact program involves all of CGIAR centers and uses a disruptive approach to overcome challenges related to the innovation supply and demand gap. In many cases, we realized that scientists may define problems that are not necessarily real or demanded by stakeholders. So the program will focus on overcoming that challenge. Also, with a number of large CGIAR centers that are involved in the work that we do, CGIAR works in well over 80 countries. We have dozen plus centers that are actively organizing. We have over 10,000 scientists. You can imagine that everyone works towards the goodwill of wanting to see science brought for development impact, but in many cases we're too fragmented and scaling efforts themselves are fragmented. So the program is designed to bring those together more appropriately. In many cases also, we've observed that scaling efforts, we have a few wonderful examples, particularly working with national agricultural research and extension system partners, where CGIAR's innovations have reached a very large scale and they have been very transformative. But we're in an increasingly competitive environment. There are many organizations that work on innovation and scaling, and we need to focus our efforts to be more effective in that environment. And last but not least, in many of the countries in which we work in, there are weak or challenging enabling environments. And in order for science and technologies to be used well and at scale, as Mark indicated in some of his slides, you need to build an enabling environment around an innovation. And so the program works to do these things. So I'll describe briefly how the program is structured. We have 5 areas of work where we tackle these different challenges. And as I identified in the previous slide, the first challenge that we aim to overcome with the program is ensuring that our stakeholders' demands for research, for innovation, and especially for scaling are taken seriously. And we're doing this by creating inventories of multiple different kinds of stakeholders, as well as country-level policy inventories, to try to triangulate the development of innovations with demand from partners. And this has not been done in a systematic way before in the history of CGIAR. I could be bold enough to say that. We do want to develop widgets and tools, dashboards and information. We are scientists, so we want to find ways to make this information that we are generating useful and accessible. But really what this is about is trying to triangulate innovation and scaling with demand. And where there is not a strong signal of demand, asking the hard question about whether a research stream or a proposed scaling stream should move forward, or if it should be potentially curtailed with funds invested in something that is more useful and impactful. This work area also supports the other 8 CGIAR science programs that Jules showed on the previous slide, in also making adaptive management decisions on an annual basis so they can make sure their work triangulates and works in response to true signals of stakeholder demand. Our second area of work focuses on impact pathways. It's about designing and optimizing impact pathways for the promising innovations that Mark presented in the beginning of the presentation. And not only those innovations, which were a small sample, but a larger universe of innovations that are high on the technology readiness level. The area of work supports bundling, putting innovations together that can support each other, and packaging within an enabling environment context. And we aim scientifically to try to understand which impact pathway may be most appropriate. For example, a strongly public sector-led pathway may be more appropriate than a more private sector-led pathway in a particular country and context for a specific innovation, or you may need to blend the two or use other kinds of partnerships. Now, this idea sounds very good, but I'll be honest, when we try to operate this at a program level in practice, it's actually quite challenging. And that's because we have a number of CGIAR centers, as I mentioned, 10,000 or more scientists that are operating and working within these. And we've realized that we need to find a way to develop a home for the work of scientists within the program that brings a more strong feel to, a more thematic feel to the work that we do. So we're in the process right now of developing what we call scaling flagships. And the scaling flagships will operate within this area of work. These are thematically logical, delivery and implementation focused. They're not research focused. They are focused on bringing the results of research into use and impact at scale. This is designed to support the other CGIAR science programs and be relevant to donors. And the way that we're starting to think about it, and again, we're developing this over time, so I'm giving you a sneak peek, is to think about work, for example, on accelerating varietal adoption through market systems, which is a strong and important area for CGIAR's work around innovations and variety development and deployment. There's a lot of work currently in the program on digital advisory services for climate and advising farmers and also agribusinesses, and we're looking for a way to package that into a scaling flagship. We have a strong interest in mechanization and irrigation services and deploying those with regenerative agricultural models in which fee-for-service arrangements for machinery or irrigation can help support the expansion of machinery technologies for agricultural systems or irrigation for a larger number of farmers. And these are just a few of these examples. The reason why we want to do this is that these flagships will build upon the other functions within the Scaling for Impact program around demand articulation, enabling environment improvements, and other work that I'll describe in the subsequent slides. But they are also designed to give a point of contact and docking point for the other CGIAR programs that do work also on these topics, but tend to focus much more at the research level. And as you see in the triangle on the left there, these are really about bringing science into use and scale. But in many cases, even with these flagships, there will be enabling environment challenges. And so we have a fabulous group that's working on what we call the Enabling Environment Lab that looks at improving the conditions for scaling through institutional policy and market mechanisms. Importantly, this group also looks at challenges around scaling from cultural and normative barriers. In many cases, there can be a cultural or general resistance to the adoption of a new technology, and this team works on identifying those challenges and finding ways to encourage behavioral change communication, both at a policy and market level, but also at a field level with respect to supporting the adoption of innovations. Our fourth area of work is called Achieving Impact Through Finance and Partnerships, and it focuses on what can be a very important and impactful pathway, which is embedding the products of CGIAR's work in large-scale international finance organization, multilateral development bank, and government investment and development programs. These programs typically operate at orders of financial magnitude far larger than CGIAR itself operates in, and in many cases can really be a way to drive impact. And so the goal from this work is to help provide technical information on best bet technologies and innovations that come from CGIAR embed them in the design of new development investments led by, for example, the African Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank, and then allowing the technologies to be scaled out through partners. And that's an important point because CGIAR itself is an intermediary organization. We're typically a group of scientists that work in the different CGIAR centers. We're not always trained to do downstream development work. We always work through partners as intermediaries. And this area of work focuses very strongly on international finance organizations, impact investors, and also corporate social responsibility funds as avenues for getting innovations into large-scale use. All of this also, as I just mentioned, cannot be done without partnerships. So I wanted to briefly show you some of the scope and the countries in which we are engaging strongly with partners. We're currently in our 2025 work plan working with 183 institutions outside of CGIAR, while also working with all of CGIAR centers and other science programs. And some of you in the audience may be representative of some of the organizations that you see below. These are organizations that we're either already collaborating with or that we're actively working to build out collaborations with, because it takes a whole family of partnerships to make innovations scale. The last area of work is called Learning for Impact, and it reflects upon the work in the prior areas of work. It reflects upon what Jules has talked about and what Mark has talked about. The Learning for Impact area does have a space that looks at scaling science and strengthening scaling science. It also looks at dynamic impact evaluation and ways to improve active learning in monitoring and evaluation processes, and also focuses on South-South capacity sharing and learning. And one of the big events that we're very proud of that occurred in the last few years, and that will also take place in October this year, is the Scaling Week that will take place in Nairobi. If you haven't been to a Scaling Week, you're missing out. It's one of the more fun, exciting, and engaging community building workshops and conferences that you could come to. So I'm going to again ask Jules or Mark to put the link to the Scaling Week website on the chat so you can have access to it, because we'd love to see all of you this October in Nairobi. So I've talked very briefly about the program. It's early days, but we're already seeing early wins, and that's really important. Some of the work that we're most excited about, for example, is the work to transform and move the Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, or TAT program, which has been led by the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture, together with the African Development Bank. And we're working on a process with donor support to formally bring that program into the scaling program so it can be managed by both pooled funding from CGIAR as well as funding from the African Development Bank, and will enable all CGIAR centers to work across Africa and embed their innovations in the continued development of new African Development Bank programs. This builds on work that has already existed from a team in IITA that's done fabulous work over the last few years developing this, but the trajectory will be that it will move into the scaling program as an appropriate home so it can work as a CGIAR-wide scaling mechanism. We've also launched a scaling coalition to mainstream innovation portfolio management systems and support work on scaling capacity sharing, and it currently includes CGIAR, the World Bank, the Gates Foundation, GIZ, and FAO. It has a lot of similarities to the scaling community of practice, and we're actually now working to have a docking point and to bring these two efforts strongly together. We've also launched the East Africa Regional Scaling Hub based in Nairobi, which provides a forum for like-minded and not like-minded scaling enthusiasts to come together and learn and strategize around scaling opportunities. We want to open another 2 regional hubs before the end of this year, and we're looking at different regions in which this will make most perfect sense. Last but not least, and very importantly though, we are also achieving real and durable impact in scale. So we see tangible impact from the work that we are already doing through these areas of work at a field level with farmers, with businesses, and we also see a number of relatively large and expanding area of new technologies planted under CGIAR innovations as well. And that's important because the ultimate goal of the program and CGIAR itself is to transform food, land, and water systems in a climate crisis. With that, I'll stop there, and I'm sure we have quite a lot of time to take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. I hope everybody found this as inspiring as I did. Just the amount of work that the CGIAR has accomplished in the last few years with the development of IPSR, the portfolio management, and now the kickoff in the last 6 months and the quick early wins of the S4I program is amazing. I also want to thank you guys for being so on time, left us plenty of time for questions. And I appreciate the fact that you've already been beavering away, answering many of these questions that were put in the chat. Nonetheless, I'm not sure everybody's reading the chat, and I wanted to come back to one of the questions we got that you already answered, Mark, but maybe you or others could dig in a little bit. Julie Howard asked on how scaling is being handled differently in the new portfolio of research programs. Can you give us a sense of the evolution from CRPs to SGs to current programs? Maybe you could even share with the audience, since not everybody is a CGIAR, what a CRP and an SG is. And if I can just add my own twist to that, all of you, particularly Julian, talked about, that you're really moving from data and analytics to decision-making and value. I can imagine that that is challenging for some of the scientists who are used to basically coming up with their own, research initiatives of things that interest them or might be important to them. And it could be a bit of a culture change or a culture shock to shift from that to, at least in part, or perhaps eventually in full, focusing on value for agri-food adopters, for donors, for, who's the market or who's the audience. So if you could talk about this, how this has, evolved, and some of those tensions, and maybe not to pile on, but how that relates to your goals from going to 40% utilization to 80 and 100. So maybe I'll just call on Julian first, and then the rest of you can chime in as you see fit. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So, yeah, just for a bit of a more contextual background, the CRP ran from 2010 to 2021. They had 2 phases, and the phase that we have the most data about that I referred to as was from 2017 to 2021. I think that's right. Frank is on the call; he can correct me. And so at that point, as mentioned, there was a way of capturing some information about innovations and innovations moving to scale. There was a very different, let's say, data collection protocol and criteria, just sort of defining how it did. It was actually a four-step process. So you went from 1, 2, 3 development, and then 4 use. So it was quite linear, and all of our data was like that. But as I mentioned, we had very few innovations with more than 1 data point. And so making sense of the data and actually identifying what was working where, why, with who, or why not, just was really difficult, as was accessing information about those best bets in that big messy pile of Lego, as Mark had described it. So that was the CRPs, and we really changed, I think, the game substantively in the period 22 to 24, and that's when this IPSR, Innovation Package Scaling Readiness protocol and approach was adopted in policy. So in our performance and results management framework, in our technical reporting arrangement, it was also then built into our systems, so that was the performance and results management system. We really started to collect more and better types of data for use to actually inform decision-making, to provide assurance, to provide greater transparency to our funders, to our partners, to our managers and teams. So that was the last 3-year period where we really, I think, changed the game and have now got this very rich data set that is on the cusp, I think, of then making the shift into decision and use. And I think this new program of science programs and accelerators, of which scaling for impact is a critical part, is really where that transition is going to take place, because we now have a program here described by Tim that's really dedicated to scaling and interfacing with innovations being developed throughout the system, and then helping them reach their potential to scale. And so there's more of an emphasis, there's more resources, there's more of a, let's say, there's just more work and capacity being allocated to make this work. So I'd say that's a big transition, and I think this is where, you know, if Tim and others in the Scaling for Impact program see value in it, I think they do, as described, then the game is almost won in a sense. Although we still have a lot of work to do, that is a critical hurdle that the Scaling for Impact program wants to use this information, is using it. And Tim, I don't know if you want to maybe talk about the supply demand work that you'll be doing, that we'll be collaborating on actually with the Digital Transformation Accelerator, just to help innovations meet demand. Thanks.
Yeah. I can briefly talk about that, and then I'd love to go back to the bigger picture question as well. But the demand alignment piece is really important, and it, again, as I mentioned, it's something where we recognize that in many cases, if you're a scientist and you have a budget that's assigned to you, you're likely in many cases to take it and use it for what you're really interested in doing, or what you are trained in doing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be using it for what's most strategically important for creating an impact, or for serving the needs of the host governments or partners in the countries in which we operate in. So we really do want to take very seriously flipping that approach and being much more purposeful about it. So what we're doing with the demand articulation piece, again, it's never been done systematically like this before. We have, in many cases, solicited demand from partners in the design of a new portfolio. We don't do it on a regular nor systematic basis. And so what we are working on doing is deploying a set of both surveys and focus group discussions with a wider diversity of stakeholders and partners in key countries in which there's a large intensity of CGIAR operations. And those tend to be, at this point in time, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Colombia. And we're starting with a subset of those countries this year to deploy those surveys, to deploy focus group discussions, to deploy a structured approach to key informant interviews to solicit demand from stakeholders. We are also at the same time working on an approach to put the policies of the governments which we partner with in those countries online, and ideally have a vision for developing an AI-assisted chatbot that allows you to chat with the policies of the countries that you might be considering working in, and testing whether a development hypothesis could potentially be supported by policies, looking for gaps in policies and so on, so scientists can essentially tune their work more appropriately to demand. But I've painted a very rosy picture there. Really what it all comes down to is incentives and funding at the end of the day. And at least what the scaling program does want to do is make sure that the activities that take place within the scaling program are funded and supported because there's a demonstrated causal link to demand, and that it's very, very well demanded in a robust way, not just having a national partner say, I like this science, I want it to happen, but really taking a wider approach and doing this more robustly. So we're unrolling that as the year goes forward. I was intrigued though by Julie's question earlier around the evolution from the CGIAR research programs into the science groups and initiatives, and now into this current portfolio. And what's really different about it, and what we did not have in any of those prior configurations, was a scaling program. If you ask anybody what's really different in the portfolio, it is the scaling program. And maybe potentially the digital accelerator that we also have around digital agriculture. But I actually think that's what's really powerful and valuable. There's a recognized need that scaling needs to stand out, and it needs to be at the forefront of CGIAR's work, and that it needs to be explicitly and exclusively funded, and that it needs to both build on and support the science, but really be very comfortable with moving downstream and working with downstream actors and being much more hands-on and involved in the scaling and development process than many scientists may initially be comfortable with. And so that the scaling program is creating a home for that work and thereby supporting the rest of the portfolio. Mark, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, our lengthy discussions there.
No, I just wanted to maybe add a bit on what on the question that Julie asked on what has changed. I think, and we referred to it a couple of times, like we don't see this as a mechanistic, like technological, like innovation portfolio management pathway. We see it really as an organizational culture change and capability change process. And I think if you look at CGIAR, I was part of the CGIAR research programs more than 10 years ago. I think like a lot of mindsets have been changing. So, you know, there was a lot, and there is probably still a lot of thinking like, well, as long as the innovation technology is good enough, then people will start using it. You know, a bit of like this idea, like, you know, you parachute an innovation into a community and it will be adopted if it outperforms the incumbent practices, which we know is not the case. And similarly, you know, trying to not think of scaling as something you do in a project, you know, a 3-year project, you scale and then the project stops and the scaling stops or people disadopt. Some of the scaling practices, you know, like how do we work with farmers on understanding like what are some of the barriers to adoption rather than, you know, incentivize them to use or adopt innovations and report on it. And when the incentives drop out, then again, there's disadoption. So I think there's a lot of like changes in the way people think, which is very powerful because, you know, my mentor, Professor Kees Leeuwers, always said, like, if there's discourse change, then you know that that is an essential component of practice change. And maybe another element I wanted to share is that I think in many of the CGIAR centers, if you would look at the share of scientists, researchers, people with a PhD involved in innovation development, science and innovation, and the share of people that are really, you know, involved in enabling conditions, policy, business, incubation, advocacy, and so forth. I think that share has also shifted. Like we have many more people in our organization now that understand the private sector, that understand the policy and you know, what it takes to develop a 200 million investment plan with the World Bank. Which doesn't mean that CGIAR will actually do the scaling, but having that kind of intelligence in the organization, I think, is also really important. And then, of course, the magic happens where these two groups actually collaborate and interface. So, yeah, I think that those are some of the maybe less tangible things, but that some of the changes I've been seeing over the past years. Thanks.
Well, that's fantastic. And I just want to comment on that last point. All of you have emphasized that the CGIAR itself is not doing the scaling, but you're facilitating the scaling through the various mechanisms that Tim has described in the S4I program. And I think this is, you know, the scaling community of practice and also the CGIAR and your work on scaling science have really emphasized the importance of this intermediary or facilitation role. But we haven't seen a lot of innovation funders who have had the time and the resources to take it seriously. So I think we're all really looking forward to seeing how this works out, what you learn, the challenges, the successes. So really very exciting. I want to move forward to another question that we got from, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, but Ken Chomitz, which is about the projected benefits methodology. Frank Place, who used to work at IFPRI, was kind enough to talk about that, but I guess I'll just want to reframe the question a little bit larger. It seems to me that if donors or others are interested in making choice, or the CGIAR itself in terms of how it allocates resources, as you said, Julian, using the portfolio management to go from just, you know, monitoring and analytics to decision making, knowing what the projected benefits are might be. One of you mentioned that in addition to the scaling readiness tool, You now also have the impact readiness assessment tool. Perhaps you could say more about that, and particularly, obviously, one could project the benefits in terms of there's potentially 5 million farmers here that could benefit from this, and it might increase, just for example, their productivity by 25%. But it seems to me that at least one part of that is also the risk. How feasible is it, or likely are we to get this to scale? So I'd be very interested, I'm not sure who, maybe Mark, you could take this first about how you project the benefits and the impact readiness assessment tool. But if you think Julian is better placed to answer that, go ahead, Julian.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. So just in terms of the projected benefits approach, this is, we've had successive rounds of this. We started with the previous portfolio with an approach to try and provide a whole of portfolio projection of benefits, really to give funders a sense of, what are they buying, what are they investing in, what are they likely to get. We've rerun that exercise last year, and it was actually a projection of ambition, I think it was, rather than benefits, because it was not based on actual programmatic content or input. So during the proposal and the initial, let's say, pitch for the portfolio, we did run the exercise, but it was not directly connected to what the portfolio would actually deliver. Now, that's changed. So the documents that I've linked there really, I think, represent the first tangible connection between programs and accelerators and this projection of benefits model, which goes to 2030 and 2040 and covers a range of impact level indicators that more or less align with the CG results framework and cover some important parts of it. So we have the first, let's say, critical connection point between the portfolio and this projection of benefits approach. Now, a couple of things. One, that is a really important part of our upcoming investment case. Two, the connection point has not been specifically and explicitly the key innovation. It has been a thing called high-level outputs, or the highest projection of what the programs and accelerators are able to say that they will deliver by 2030. So the innovations are in there, but not as the explicit, let's say, content or handshake piece between the programs, accelerators, and the projected benefits. So that needs to change, and we have a really exciting opportunity moving forward. There is a Gates Foundation funded project called MELIAC, Monitoring, Evaluation, Learning, Impact Assessment, and Foresight, that aims to better integrate all of those pieces across functions and entities in the CG to really allow greater interoperability and let us navigate with greater assurance and to spend less money on duplicating things internally. And so one of the key parts of that 3-year project will be to better link theories of change and projected benefits, so that during the cycle of adaptive management, we have an annual pause and reflect, what, so what, now what kind of a thing, where programs and accelerators will be looking at their achievements against their theory of change, looking at external sort of context parameters, and then defining, well, what do we do about that going forward? So as part of that, we really want to integrate the ability to play with that projection of benefits model linked to their theories of change, so that they can actually start to have that feedback loop in terms of, what if we do this? What if we do that? What is it likely to eventuate? How can we tune our approach to better actually take advantage of that projection of benefits approach? So that's one really important part that we want to strengthen, and obviously making the top innovations surface in that connection between the theories of change and projected benefits will be a really important use case for the data that we're providing here, and a great tangible input to that modeling exercise. Tim or Mark, if you'd like to compliment, thanks.
Very apropos follow-up question here, which is from Simon Winter, which I'm sorry, did one of you want to say something on this point before we move on?
Oh, I was hoping we would draw on Simon's question, because it's an excellent question.
Well, he has two. I'm not sure which you're referring to, but I'll try to read them both. The chat's getting quite long, so I'm taking a minute. I'm sorry to find it here. But the first one was what I believe is, when is the appropriate time to engage government, private sector, and social enterprise as potential scaling partners for specific innovations? Some would argue, in fact, the scaling community of practice generally advises that early in the research and innovation stage, that we should know who the final users are and even the scalers are. Is this going to go to scale through a private sector pathway, through the government, through NGOs, or whatever? Is there funding available for scaling, as well as a sustainable funding model at scale? So could you, one of you talk, or all of you talk about when we should engage and how we should engage as we move all the way from basic R&D through research, innovation, piloting, et cetera, et cetera. Mark, do you want to take this first?
Yeah, I'll have a first go, Tim, and then if you want, you feel free to add. I agree. It's an excellent question. I think different kinds of partners and the role and the intensity of the collaboration will change, like along an impact pathway. There are definitely important roles for end users, for scaling partners, for investors to play, like early on in the process. You need to somehow know, like, what are the boundary conditions, what are the needs, what are the kinds of systems in which people are operating and face challenges and are looking for solutions. I think it's also then fine that the science and research, participatory or in the laboratory, do their thing, and try to come up with best possible solutions. Sometimes maybe too expensive, too complex, that can also be refined later on in the process. So I think, like, especially in the initial research and innovation process, there have to be touch points, there have to be kind of agreements, but you don't have to always do everything together. That's a personal opinion. Then I think at some point, like where you see that innovations are proven to work, because that's of course like a key condition, and where the piloting start, that's of course where you start like engaging scaling partners. That's where you test with them. That's where you de-risk them. That's where where it still makes sense to provide some compensation to a farmer, who offers their land and their labor and their other kinds of resources to test together with you whether an innovation actually works under, let's say, semi-controlled conditions. And then from there, of course, you want to move into a situation where people are willing to pay, where things are affordable, where they are accessible through existing delivery systems or new delivery systems, where they are supported by policy and finance mechanisms. So, your engagement, who you engage and the intensity of engagement changes like through the process. I think, to go to another extreme, what we've seen too much is, where researchers and research organizations, including CGIAR, try to figure it all out by themselves and think that they have, an excellent product, and go to the scaling partners and go to the users and they say like, well, yeah, but this is too expensive. You need a PhD to actually operate these things. I don't like the color. I don't like the taste, and so forth and so forth. So I think that is the other end of the spectrum, and you need to find the right balance. Over.
And if I may take a leaf from what Mark was saying, I think it also depends. Well, in many cases, I also think those of us on this call would agree that when you start an innovation, you should have some idea of how you're going to scale it and who you're going to work with. That tends to go without saying, at least amongst this community. It's not necessarily the day-to-day practice still within CGIAR, and there's still many technologies and innovations that have probably failed because we went too far in research without asking those critical questions early on. But that said, it also depends on the innovation. Some innovations will be relatively quick to complete a research cycle and then release and potentially make use of. Some are going to be much more blue sky, hypothetical, and have very, very long development time horizons. And in a longer time horizon, you may find that policies change, governments may change, market actors may change. So what's important is to have an idea of who you will want to work with, but also remain flexible in the case of longer-term innovations. An example I can give is golden rice as a genetic engineering technology that CGIAR has worked on for a very long time, has only really moved into commercialization in specific places. But in many of the countries where it was originally intended for, you have seen significant changes in governments and actors that would potentially accept or reject that, let alone consumer preferences as well. But what is important is understanding who you might be scaling with and having a plan of action, at least around thinking around that when developing an early stage innovation idea. And particularly in that, I think it's important to have an idea of how will the innovation add value to multiple stakeholders, and really what would be their motivation for interacting with it, and not assuming that something we develop as scientists is just great simply because it has a high probability of a statistical value, or we can demonstrate through a peer-reviewed paper that it is somehow good. It's being much more deliberate about that. If I could take a moment, though, I'd like to go to one of the questions that Simon also asked, which was essentially, should CGIAR be the innovation broker, or should CGIAR work through networks of innovation brokers? And I think it's a really stimulating and interesting question that builds upon the last question. The answer to that, of course, is that it will depend. CGIAR, again, is a scientific organization. We're not necessarily immediately fit for purpose to do downstream development work. Almost everything we do in our theory of change is through partnerships, right? So it makes sense that we're working through networks of innovation brokers. But in some countries, you may find that, for example, the National Agricultural Research System is extremely well established and can be a very strong innovation broker in and of itself. Think, for example, how Ethiopia operates, or I could even say India or Bangladesh operates. You have very strong systems where we can work very deliberately with them, and then they can really be the broker, and in many cases, the scaling partner. There are also other countries where market systems are far more important. And in the case of market systems, they tend to be a bit more diffuse. You don't have an immediate point of contact to work with, so you have to work with a wider diversity of partners. Kenya, as an example, or parts of Bangladesh as an example as well. And in those situations, I think it's appropriate for CGIAR to be a much more immediate innovation broker and actually be interacting with partners on a wider basis as well. But it does depend on the country, does depend on the context. Again, I think the answer ultimately to the question is to ensure that you're purposeful about how we're approaching it, depending on those contexts.
Well, I think we'll take one last question. Actually, we have plenty of time, so let me encourage those of you to put who are on here. So there's been a lengthy back and forth between Mark and Harry Pommier about this question of what I think Mark has been calling triangulation, which is on the one hand, and it follows perfectly on what we were just discussing, the goal is to obviously benefit farmers, small producers, nutrition for the population in general, et cetera, and we want to make sure that there are innovations that are meeting their expressed needs and demand. On the other hand, we need to make sure that there's a viable scaling pathway, primarily, but not necessarily, through the private sector. And at the same time, if I understand correctly, while CGIAR has funding to act as this scaling intermediary or facilitator, it doesn't have funding to actually do the scaling. And that's why there's area of work 4, where is mobilizing funding, often through donors, but possibly through national governments, partnering with existing donor projects. Mark, could you just talk a little bit more about how you, I'm not even sure triangulate is the right way here, maybe if it's a word, quadrilate, between, demand on the ground, the bottom up, the need for a viable business model, the need for funding for the scaling itself, as well as the long-term business model. How you do that, what the challenges are, how you're trying to work on that.
Yeah, I'll try, Richard, because it's a difficult question. Like, I think if you look at any kind of like private sector portfolio or pipeline approach, like everything starts with needs and demand. So if you as a startup or as a small business cannot show to your investors that there is need for your products or services, then they will never invest in you. We have an ongoing debate in CGIAR, like whose demand counts, because our funders also have demands. So they don't just follow like the demand articulation or demand intelligence that we get from the ground and say like, well, you have a solid case here, we'll fund you. They also have their priorities and they also have their wishes. Now, I think two things. One, I've put in the chat. I think we try to talk about effective demand, and effective demand happens at the interface of where you have good solutions. There's problems that you want to or that you can solve with it, and there's finance. Sometimes there's a problem, there's a solution, but there's no investor. It's not going to lead to impact. Similarly, like if you have a problem, you have an investment, but there's no solution, it's not going to lead to impact. So I think managing that triangle is very important. And then the second part of the equation is perhaps, if we have better demand intelligence, like coming from the clients, from the governments that we work with, but also from farmers and other kinds of end users, I think we can also build a better case towards our investors, saying like, there's in India, we identified this need. The government is behind us. They are ready to co-invest. We have biofortified crops or whatever we have as a solution. Help us here to close the gap. So I think, with this kind of portfolio level intelligence, we are able to make much stronger business cases towards investors. And I think that is, it may still sound very much like funder driven, but I think like ultimately farmers on the ground, they will benefit from these kinds of approaches. So I see Tim nodding. I'm not sure, Tim, if you want to add or whether that was just an overall sense of agreement.
It was a general sense of agreement, but I do think it's challenging, and I get that. The only point I will add is that I think in many cases it's context specific, it's innovation specific, and then it's context specific. That can sometimes sound like a bit of a cop-out, but it's not meant to be a cop-out. It's really meant to say that you need to be very aware. We need to be analyzing the situations in which we're working in and designing activities that respond to those changing contexts.
I don't see any more questions in the chat.
Richard, can I
Please,
maybe add one? Yeah, sure. I just want to add one. It's a bit of a philosophical reflection, but I think also like we're talking increasingly about like agri-food system transformation. I think, and it's I'm not going to answer it, I'm just going to put it there. Like if we always work on demand, then maybe we don't work on transformation agendas, because transformations often require like very disruptive, radical changes in how a food system works, and that may not always come from demand-driven approaches. So there's a little bit of a tension as well, where maybe transformation agendas also need sometimes like supply-driven approaches. But what should always be the focus is like problems and solutions. But of course, sometimes incremental solutions can be fine. But sometimes you also need to think about like what are the radical disruptive transformations that are needed, to change the way food systems work and some of the power inequalities that are inhabited in it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So we had a series of questions from Kate Gardner, which I'm not going to be able to do justice to, but I'll try at least to summarize, I think, the last few in one question. I thought was particularly interesting. She said, well, what if you've all talked about the importance of the fact that traditionally CGIAR staff are scientists, usually technical scientists, breeders, geneticists, biologists, etymologists, et cetera, entomologists, sorry. I know you don't study the history of language. how, and you have a training program, thank you, Mark, or maybe it was Julian who put in line the online training course, and I know that you've been doing training. Can you talk a little bit more, because this is a mainstreaming workshop, in terms of how you are trying to build first build the skill set, the competence, the experience of CGIAR staff, who I assume are predominantly scientists, though Mark did allude to the fact that you have more diverse staffing of backgrounds than historically. That's been shifting. How that's going, what some of the challenges are, and particularly, Kate asked, I think, in cases where scaling readiness might be stuck, do you provide coaching or other types of technical support to help a team move further down the scaling readiness pathway from whatever they might be at, a 5 to a 6, or a 6 to a 7 to an 8? Again, I don't know who wants to take that one first. Mark, maybe, or Tim?
Yeah,
Mark,
I can
wanna
say.
go?
Yeah, I could say something. I think there's there has been, maybe unintentionally, we focused quite a bit on the innovation tracking and the data collection on innovations initially. Whereas the scaling readiness approach, as I presented it, is like, first and foremost, it's a tool that's supposed to help innovation teams or scientists or projects to advance, to understand, like, where are we, what's the next step, what are the bottlenecks, enabling environment, who do we need to work with. So it's very much like a method that asks the difficult questions. Let's put it like that. In 2023, we trained like 100 people across CGIAR system, and some also working with external partner organizations. And like, many of them became like champions of the approach and took it to their center, to their project, to their country. And that is still helping us till today. I think with the Scaling for Impact program, we have much more mandate and capacity and bandwidth to actually go in and help with advancing readiness, advancing use. Now, I wrote also in the chat, like, readiness, taking an idea to something that's proven to work under uncontrolled conditions. In many ways, it follows like the process of scientific inquiry. You do a literature review, you do basic research, you formulate concepts, you test them, you take them into a laboratory, and then into a farmer field, and then into real world. So there, like, people somehow get it and understand, like, what is the what's the process and why it matters and why it's important to document it and to publish and all these kind of things. I think in like taking those proven already innovations into action or into practice, that is where people need much more support, and where maybe scientists are not the best, don't bring the best skill set. So maybe there needs to be like teams, interdisciplinary team, where the role of the scientist changes or reduces over time, and where the people who understand policy, business, market, finance, like, come in and then take it and move it along those use levels. The last thing, maybe, like, I started in the first slide saying that innovation is the core business of CGIAR. We have a lot of like capacity, people working on gender responsible innovation, user-centered design, human-centered design, and so forth. I think like now what we are trying to do is bringing those capacities together, trying to build interdisciplinary teams around innovations, especially those that are like very promising, and then support them along long impact pathway. But definitely, like, the support mechanisms is where you really make some of the change. So you can be aware of where you are and what is needed, but then making sure that there's the right skill sets to actually do it is next level.
Okay. Tim, rather than you coming in, I'd like to sneak in one more question in the few minutes we have left. We have a really good question from Mark Heisinger that somehow I overlooked, and I want to come back to. Mark worked for many years at the USAID's Feed the Future program, particularly leading their efforts on scaling, and did a major study several years ago about different approaches and challenges in scaling. And coming out of that work, he asks, USAID found substantially different approaches were required to scale a new crop variety versus a product versus a service, versus even within products. I'm adding to his question, machinery versus seeds, and certainly versus policies. Is CGIAR in your work on researching these distinctions, are you researching these distinctions and how pathways and approaches to scaling are different? And if I can just add to that, a lot of these, one of the things also that the USAID work found was that, and this is clearly very strongly integrated into your work, is systems change. Obviously, that's, I think, area of work 3. But funders often don't like to fund systems change. You know, they don't see the tangible, immediate benefits. They say, oh, you want to take this new seed to scale, this new product, this service that we get, but well, policy reform they might get, but strengthening market systems or access or demand, wow, this is a lot of work. It's expensive, takes a long time. So could you talk about these two questions and how they fit together? On the one hand, the challenges or how you're thinking about scaling all these different subcategories, products, varieties, services, policies, and how that also links to the issue of systems change. I'm sorry, Mark, but I think this is still in your wheelhouse, but I will, Tim, do come in here.
Sure. Thanks. And for that, I'll go back to that one slide where I put up the scaling flagships that we're working on developing right now. In the first year of the program, we've got a lot of people that are doing research and scaling on a wide variety of technologies, tools, practices, and so on. It's a bit too much of doing everything everywhere all at once. And so we're in a process.
Sounds like a great title for a movie.
It does. But we're in a process of trying to very deliberately focus on fewer, more thematically coherent and clear pieces of work that we are doing. And it's really built upon Mark's comment, which is if you're trying to scale a variety, depending on what country you're working in, but you're definitely going to be working in some way, shape, or form with regulatory systems around registration of a variety and getting it released. You're also going to need to be interacting with government, depending on whether the crop is a notified or government-controlled crop versus something that's been more pulled into commercialization. But in many cases, you're also going to be working with seed companies, and in many of the environments that CGIAR works in, that's working with a lot of smaller seed companies as well. That takes a particular kind of technical expertise and understanding. That is completely different, going to Mark's example early on of a livestock vaccine. With a livestock vaccine, you're going to be working with veterinary services, you're going to be working with training and creating demand amongst farmers for the vaccine. You may have to get farmers to understand the process of how a vaccine works. You're also going to be working in some cases with cold chains, but not in that example. You will also need to work almost in all cases with regulatory mechanisms as well. That also takes a completely different kind of technical expertise. And the examples go on from there. So the work that we're doing in the program is picking a few high-profile areas where there's a lot of work that CGIAR does that fits into those categories, recognizing, not just recognizing the different pathways and approaches that need to be made, but deliberately working to form teams that can work on those pathways very deliberately and explicitly, and also interact with the CGIAR programs that are doing research on those areas, but be much more downstream and hands-on focused. So it's not so much an answer to your question, Mark, of are we studying it? What we're actually doing is we're trying to implement it. What I will hope that we can say by the 3-year time from now is that we have studied it also significantly while being in the process of doing it, and that it's documented with a relatively high level of scientific rigor, if possible, in that process. With respect to funding systems change, it's a very good question. CGIAR's funding mix is a bit complicated. I'll leave it at that, but it's a mix of deliberate designated funding where donors can buy into a particular area of work because they recognize and like it. And it's also a mix of funding that is what we call pooled, which is unrestricted, undesignated funding. And then also, as Jules said, bilateral projects that can interoperate with the scaling program, but are distinct and need to deliver to the particular demands of a donor in a specific place on a specific topic. The pooled funding is one of the places where we do have some flexibility to then be able to invest in things that may be harder to get donors to invest in around systems change. So we have mechanisms that we can use to try to help fill those gaps, but they're not always perfect. What we are working on doing is interacting with donors, and I think many of you are on the call that know this too painfully and have a strong awareness of this, but the donor community is changing dramatically this year and will be different next year, probably even compared to this year. But we are working on a quite aggressive fundraising campaign and interaction campaign with donors in Q3 and Q4 of this year to round out those needed areas of work to make sure that they're invested in and we can operate things that are not always the most sexy things that would be funded, but are absolutely necessary building blocks for scaling.
Well, thank you, all three of you, very, very much. We're over time, so I'm not going to take too much time. I just want everybody in the audience to know that this webinar video will be posted on the Scaling Community of Practice website probably by the end of next week and probably in the next few days. Just don't want to make any promises. We also hope to have a short written summary up there. And I assume, but I want to ask, can we also post the PowerPoint up there that you all presented? Is that a yes? Yeah. Okay, great.
We need to clean out some of the back-end slides, but then we can post it.
So please look forward to that. This webinar, this working group will be taking the summer off, but we will be back in the fall. Bigger, better, and fresher and more exciting than ever before. But more seriously, we already have lined up actually a wonderful webinar with a tool that is very similar in some ways to the Scaling Readiness tool, which is Innovation to Impact, that was developed by USAID's Feed the Future program financing by the Soybean Innovation Lab. It's a different take, so you might see compare and contrast. I hope we'll have that webinar sometime in September. Thank you all for participating. Thank our three speakers and the CGIAR for the amazing work you're doing, and good luck in the future. And to everybody in the audience and our wonderful panelists, I wish you a great summer. Thank you so much.